Hello class, today we're going to be talking about the American Revolution. Last chapter we talked about the French and Indian War and a lot of the causes and effects of it. However, the French and Indian War itself was one of the first causes of the American Revolution. The British spent a lot of money fighting the French and Indian War, and after it was over they wanted to get back the money through making the colonists pay for it. The war essentially was to defend the colonists from the French and the Native Americans that were becoming aggressive towards certain outposts. So they felt that the colonists may not have done their part or fought hard enough in the war, and they thought that it was only fair to maybe start passing taxes and different laws on the colonists so they could help pay for the war effort. So the French and Indian War itself, because it cost so much money to fight, for the British to fight, was one of the first causes that led up to the American Revolution. Taxes were a big deal going forward in the American Revolution. So the Stamp Act was one of the other taxes that received a huge response from the colonists. The Stamp Act was a tax on all paper products. Any paper product had to have a royal stamp, or else it was deemed illegal. The stamp cost money. Today, this would be the equivalent of the government putting a tax on every text message, Facebook post, Snapchat post, or Instagram posting that someone did online. You can imagine if the government passed a law that approved a tax like that, that would do that to anyone that was posting on the internet, that would probably receive a very negative response by anyone that affects, especially when you're talking about taxing almost every form of communication that they have besides spoken word of mouth. Remember guys, back in these days, paper communication was the only way people could communicate besides word of mouth. There wasn't telephones or internet or anything like that yet. So the Stamp Act elicited a very negative response from the colonists. It went as far as them to murder tax collectors, which the British government saw as almost a terroristic type of reaction to the Stamp Act. The Navigation Acts came as well, I should say. The Navigation Acts put a limit on who the colonists could trade with and who they could work with when it came to shipping companies that worked out of Europe. The Navigation Acts pretty much made it illegal for the colonists to trade with anyone besides Britain in the long run. So you got to imagine that this would receive a pretty negative reaction if you could sell your products, whether it's farming products or manufactured goods that you make, to another country for more money, but you're not allowed to because your government has laws against you doing that and makes you sell it to them for less money than you could make from it. You can imagine that people would probably not like that, and it would receive a very negative reaction from the people whose lives that it affects on a day-to-day basis. So the Navigation Acts were another cause walking up into the Revolutionary War. In the following chapter, we will go over all these causes in a more depth manner. The Sugar Act was another tax that the British put upon the colonists. The Sugar Act didn't receive the worst response from the colonists because it was more of a luxury tax. Sugar was more of a luxury item. People didn't need it on a day-to-day basis. It wasn't like taxing their paper products or their farming products or anything like that. So the Sugar Act was another tax that people didn't like, but it wasn't as big of a deal as, let's say, the Stamp Act. The Boston Massacre. When the Boston Massacre happened, it was less than 10 people who were shot and killed, or injured and killed, I should say. However, it was more of a propaganda campaign to refer to it as a massacre. They wanted people to be fired up about it. They wanted people to be angry about what happened in Boston that day. And eventually, John Adams, who would eventually become the second president of the United States, would be the lawyer and the defendant and the defense attorney for the soldiers that took place in the Boston Massacre. He will eventually get them cleared of their charges, and argue, in his defense, he will argue that they were provoked and in fear for their own lives when they fired into the crowd. Pretty much saying that the crowd incited the violence. Whether or not that's true, the soldiers will get off, and John Adams is trying to prove that the colonists can handle, governing themselves, having a serious legal system, that they can handle, trying the soldiers in an unbiased court. He thinks it'll go a long way with the British, and that the British may start giving them a little bit more freedom, but it really doesn't. They don't really get anything for it. Giving the soldiers that fair trial that day. At least not as much as they thought they would. Eventually, also, the Tea Act was another tax that the colonists did not like. It was a tax on all tea products. And not only was it a tax on American tea, but it allowed for British tea companies to bring in tea that was much cheaper that the colonists couldn't even compete with. It would essentially start putting colonial tea merchants out of business. Some of the first coffee shops in the United States were actually protests against the Tea Act, as well as the Navigation Acts. Think about it. If the British tea companies are selling tea cheaper than you can compete with, and you're usually a tea merchant that sells tea, and you start selling coffee and turn your shop into a coffee shop, well, you're breaking a couple laws right there in protest of the British government. One, you're not supposed to trade with any other country, and Britain doesn't have any coffee. So you're obviously trading with another another country, I should say, if you have coffee. And turning your tea shop into a coffee shop is putting it on display. So you think about that next time you go by a Starbucks or a Dunkin' Donuts. Some of the first coffee shops in this country were actually protests to unfair rules and taxes that were placed on the people who lived here. The Tea Act would eventually bring about the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party is when a lot of colonists dress up as Native Americans. They throw the tea overboard and turn the harbor into, as what one witness says, as a big cup of tea. The last straw, as they say, were the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were a series of laws. One, they closed Boston Harbor. They just shut down Boston Harbor. You have to imagine, if you make your money importing or exporting products in and out of Boston Harbor, then your whole life has just been put on hold. How you are going to provide for your family is unknown now. You got to imagine that itself received a large response. Also, they made it so people had to quarter soldiers in their homes, whether or not they wanted to. You got to imagine, if the government showed up to people's homes and started forcing them to take in soldiers, they wouldn't be all that happy about it. You have to imagine. There was a few other laws that came with the Intolerable Acts, but one also was the revoking of the Massachusetts Colonial Charter. That would be the British revoking the Massachusetts Colonial Charter is like the equivalent if the United States government were to revoke the Florida State Charter. And Florida is just not a state anymore. No more Florida Constitution, no more Florida laws. Maybe Georgia and Alabama are going to split up the land where Florida used to be. Essentially, taking away the Massachusetts Colonial Charter would be very similar to that kind of situation. And then eventually, guys, the Declaration of Independence is pretty much the end. It's a breakup letter, essentially. It's the most famous American historical breakup letter. It is the letter that breaks the United States up with Great Britain. It's not a declaration of war, but essentially the Americans know that after the Declaration of Independence is sent to Great Britain, that a hard-fought war is going to follow, because they know that Great Britain is not just going to let them take the land that they think is theirs away from them. So in the following chapter, class, we're going to fill out a double cause and effect organizer. That's going to weigh all the causes and effects leading up to the American Revolution from the French and Indian War, as well as a compare and contrast organizer with which we will weigh the advantages and disadvantages that the colonial army and the British Army have against one another. So we can go ahead and get started. You guys can flip to the assigned pages and start working on your graphic organizers. If anyone wants to use the digital textbook with the screen reader, just raise your hand and I can get you set up on the desktop. Unless you have any questions, please go ahead and get started.